What if the most powerful country on earth is being run by a man who does not understand the power he holds? That is the question haunting Washington right now, and the man asking it loudest used to sit inside the room where America's biggest decisions were made. Before we go further, hit like on this video, subscribe if you want the real story behind global power, and share this with someone who still thinks the empire is safe. Now let's get into it. For almost 100 years, two countries ran the world. First Britain, then America. Both of them ruled the same way. Not through huge armies marching across continents, but through control of the oceans. Whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled trade. Whoever controlled trade controlled the world. It sounds simple, but it worked for generations. There was another trick both empires used: keep the big land powers divided. If Germany and Russia ever became close friends, that would be a nightmare for a sea power like Britain. So Britain worked for decades to keep them apart. America inherited that same playbook after World War II. Keep China and Russia from getting too close. Keep enemies weak, keep allies dependent, and never let any single rival grow strong enough to challenge you on land, because a land power with real resources and real population can eventually outmuscle a navy. This strategy actually explains a lot about how America behaved for most of the 20th century. A sea power does not need a giant standing army sitting on its own borders, because oceans already protect it. That freedom lets it invest more in its economy, in innovation, in building wealth instead of soldiers. And when it does go to war, the old playbook says, wait. Let the other powers exhaust themselves first, then step in late and never try to conquer the whole continent. Just make sure no single rival ever gets strong enough to dominate the others. That was the winning formula for centuries. For a while, this worked perfectly for the United States. After the Soviet Union collapsed, America stood alone. No rival empire, no competing superpower, just one country calling the shots across the entire planet. Some scholars called it the unipolar moment, a once-in-history situation where a single nation had no real competition anywhere. But here's the problem with being on top for too long. You start believing it will last forever, and history does not care what you believe. Right now, something enormous is shifting. China has grown from a developing nation into the second largest economy on Earth, with an industrial base that, in many areas, already outproduces the West. Russia, despite years of sanctions and war, controls more natural resources and more territory than any country on the planet. Iran, a country America has tried to isolate for decades, has shown it can strike back in ways nobody in Washington expected. Put these three together, and you get something the world has not seen in centuries. Not just one rising power, but an entire alliance of massive land-based nations stretching from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Meanwhile, the one thing that made America dominant, its navy, its control of the seas, is slowly losing its grip. And according to people who spent their careers inside the highest levels of the American government, this shift was coming no matter who sat in the White House. It is bigger than any single president. It is bigger than any election. It is a slow, grinding shift in where power actually lives on this planet. But there is a twist, a very dangerous one. This shift was supposed to happen gradually. Empires usually decline over decades, sometimes over a century, with time to adjust, time to negotiate a soft landing. But according to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, a man who served as chief of staff to a former United States Secretary of State, and who watched foreign policy get made from the inside for years, nobody planned for what is happening now. Nobody expected the decline of American global power to collide with a leader as chaotic, as unpredictable, and as disconnected from reality as the one currently in charge. Wilkerson does not hold back when describing him. He talks about a president surrounded by almost total power, operating inside a system that has been building since the end of World War II. This system has two halves. One half is what Wilkerson calls the national security state, the military and intelligence machinery built to fight the Cold War and never dismantled. The other half is what he calls the predatory capitalist state, the giant corporations that profit directly from war, weapons, and global dominance. Here is the disturbing part. These two systems are not separate anymore. They are tangled together. The biggest defense companies sell weapons to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is their largest customer. Energy giants depend on military protection for their overseas operations, and the military depends on energy giants to keep the war machine running. It is a closed loop, feeding itself, growing bigger every year, no matter who is president, no matter what party controls Congress. And now, according to Wilkerson, this entire self-feeding machine is being steered by a leader many people close to the government believe is simply not fit to run it. Someone erratic, someone who treats foreign policy like a reality show, someone who talks tough, but has, in Wilkerson's words, gutted the very institutions that once made America's power effective in the first place. Let's pause here and add some real history to this, because it puts everything in a much sharper light. Back in the late 1890s, America fought a short war against Spain and walked away with new territory overseas, including the Philippines. For the first time, the country was openly running an empire the way Europe had for centuries. Some of the most famous writers of that era, people who loved the country deeply, warned that this path would slowly poison something inside the national character. They argued that once a republic starts acquiring colonies and ruling over other people by force, it starts losing touch with the values it claimed to stand for in the first place. That warning was more than 100 years old, and yet it feels almost custom written for today. Except this time, the empire being discussed is not built on a handful of overseas territories. It is built on roughly 800 military installations scattered across nearly every region of the globe. Compare that to any of America's modern rivals, and the difference is staggering. Even generous estimates put the total number of overseas bases operated by China and Russia combined at a small fraction of that number. No other country on Earth even comes close to matching that kind of global military footprint. And normally, land-based powers do not even attempt something on that scale. Stay with me, because this is where it gets even more interesting. Before we continue, if this kind of deep geopolitical breakdown is what you come here for, smash that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next one. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. Let's talk about diplomacy, because this is where Wilkerson gets most emotional. For most of modern history, the golden rule of great power politics was simple. Diplomacy comes first. The military exists to back up diplomacy, not replace it. A famous military strategist once said something like this, that diplomacy without military strength is powerless, but the reverse is just as true. Military strength without diplomacy is blind and dangerous. According to people who worked inside the State Department for decades, that balance has completely collapsed. The diplomatic corpse has been hollowed out. Experienced career diplomats have been pushed aside or resigned. Entire embassies operate with skeleton staff. And instead of quiet negotiations happening behind closed doors, foreign policy now gets announced through social media posts, dramatic television interviews, and sudden threats that catch even close allies off guard. Think about what that actually means. When you remove diplomacy from the equation, the only tool left is force, sanctions, military, threats, aircraft carriers parked off foreign coastlines. And right now, close to 2 billion people on this planet live under some form of American sanctions. 2 billion? That is a quarter of humanity living under economic pressure from one single country. For a while, this approach seemed to work because it was cheap. Wars fought far from American soil. Bombs dropped on countries that could not fight back the same way. America could. Sanctions that hurt economies thousands of miles away without American families feeling the pain directly. It allowed for years of strategic mistakes without any real consequences at home. There is also the matter of money, and this part rarely gets talked about honestly. When a major military alliance expands and pulls in new member countries, those new members usually need to modernize their militaries to meet alliance standards. That means new contracts, new weapons purchases, new long-term deals with the same handful of giant defense manufacturers that already dominate the industry. Every new member added to that alliance is also a new customer added to the books of those companies. It is not the only reason alliances expand, but pretending money plays no role in these decisions would be naive. But that free ride is ending, and the world just watched it end in real time. When sanctions and military pressure were used against China, the expectation in Washington was that Chinese technology companies would collapse without access to American chips. That did not happen. Chinese industry adapted, innovated, and kept moving forward. When Russia invaded Ukraine and the West responded with the harshest sanctions package in modern history, American officials predicted the Russian economy would crumble within weeks. That did not happen either. The war dragged on for years, and Russia's economy, while damaged, did not collapse the way it was supposed to. And when tensions escalated with Iran, the assumption inside Washington was that Iran would fold quickly under pressure. Instead, Iran showed a level of military capability and resistance that stunned analysts who had spent decades underestimating it. 3 separate confrontations, 3 separate predictions of quick, easy victory, 3 separate outcomes that did not match the confident forecasts coming out of Washington think tanks and television studios. So, what went wrong? According to Wilkerson, this is not really about bad intelligence or bad luck. It is about arrogance. A whole generation of policymakers grew up believing American power was limitless, and they built entire careers on that assumption. Admitting the world had changed would mean admitting their worldview was outdated, and very few people in power are willing to do that, especially when their reputations, their careers, and sometimes their fortunes depend on the old story staying true. There is one more piece of this puzzle that rarely gets discussed, and it might be the saddest part of all. For decades, America built a network of allied nations around the world, countries that depended on American protection, American markets, and American military guarantees. In return, those countries lined up behind American foreign policy, almost automatically. But that arrangement only works one way. It only works as long as the dominant power stays strong enough and stable enough to actually deliver on its promises. Right now, many of those same allied nations are quietly starting to hedge their bets. They are not abandoning old alliances outright, at least not yet, but they are diversifying, building new trade relationships, opening new diplomatic channels with the very rivals America has spent decades trying to isolate. When the countries depending on you start looking for backup plans, that alone tells you something important about how confident they really are in your staying power. Loyalty built on strength has a way of quietly dissolving the moment that strength starts to look uncertain, and that process is already well underway, even if most people are not paying close enough attention to notice it happening in real time. This is the emotional core of everything Wilkerson is warning about. It is not really about China's rise or Russia's resilience or Iran's resistance. It is about a country that refuses to look honestly at its own reflection. A country still telling itself the same story about being the greatest power on earth, even as the evidence piling up says otherwise. And here is where the real tragedy begins, because this is not only a story about foreign policy, it is a story about what is happening inside America itself. Wilkerson makes a comparison that should stop you in your tracks. He compares the current moment to the final years of the Roman Empire, when the character of whoever sat at the top started to matter more than the strength of the institutions. Underneath him, in a healthy system, no single leader can do permanent damage because checks and balances hold the structure together. But Wilkerson argues something different is happening now. The checks are still technically there on paper, but in practice, almost nobody is using them. He describes watching lawmakers who privately admit deep concerns about the direction of the country, yet publicly vote in lockstep with a leader many of them do not actually trust. He describes a legislature that had every legal tool available to intervene and simply chose not to use it. Not because the tools were missing, but because the will to use them was missing. And then there's the American public itself. This is maybe the most painful part of Wilkerson's argument. He does not blame a single politician for the situation the country finds itself in. He blames apathy. He describes most citizens as watching from the sidelines, going about daily routines, scrolling through their phones, while decisions that will shape the next 50 years get made without any real pushback. No mass protests capable of shifting policy. No serious political movement demanding accountability. Just a quiet, uneasy acceptance that this is simply how things are now. He points to history for context. The founders of the American Republic wrote extensively about what would eventually destroy their creation. Not foreign armies, not economic collapse alone, but a citizenry that stopped paying attention, stopped educating itself, and slowly lost the habit of holding power accountable. Reading their old letters and private notes today feels eerily like reading a warning written specifically for this exact moment, even though it was written more than 2 centuries ago. So how bad could this actually get? Wilkerson does not shy away from the darkest possibility. He has openly stated that he believes the odds of serious civil conflict inside the United States within the next year are uncomfortably high, somewhere around 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. Think about that for a second. A former senior government insider, someone who spent decades studying exactly this kind of instability in other countries, is now applying that same lens to his own homeland and does not like what he sees. This is not some random online commentator making wild predictions for clicks. This is someone who watched foreign policy get made from inside the room, someone who studied the collapse of other governments as part of his job, now looking at his own country and seeing familiar warning signs. And underneath all of this sits one uncomfortable truth that ties the entire story together. A nation that spent decades building the most powerful military machine in human history, spread across roughly 800 bases around the globe, more than every rival combined many times over, somehow finds itself unable to solve its own internal problems. All that strength projected outward, and almost none of it available to hold the country together at home. There is a story Wilkerson often returns to, one that shows just how far things have drifted. Years ago, at a private seminar, a former Secretary of Defense explained a hard technical truth. No missile defense system in history had ever managed to reliably shoot down an incoming target more than a small fraction of the time. As an engineer by training, he was convinced that no system built afterward would meaningfully change that math. At that same gathering, the mood around Russia was actually hopeful. Senior officials from both parties believed a genuinely multipolar world could be built together with Moscow, carefully and deliberately, instead of by accident decades later. That hope did not survive. Alliance expansion moved forward anyway, partly because new member nations meant new defense. Contracts for the same handful of giant weapons manufacturers who profit from tension staying high. A cooperative future that once seemed within reach was slowly traded away for something else entirely, until what could have been a managed, peaceful transition into a multipolar world instead became a slow-motion confrontation nobody quite planned, but everybody somehow allowed to happen anyway. There was a moment, according to Wilkerson, where things could have gone differently. When the current president first ran for office, part of his appeal was a promise to pull back from endless wars overseas, to stop spending resources on global commitments that were bleeding the country dry, and to focus inward for once. For a brief moment, even critics who distrusted him personally found themselves hoping this promise might actually be real. A genuine pullback, done carefully and intelligently, could have given the country breathing room to fix itself while still maintaining a respected place in the world. That did not happen. Instead of stepping back, military commitments expanded. Instead of fewer conflicts, tensions grew in multiple regions at once. Instead of rebuilding diplomacy, the diplomatic corps shrank even further. Whatever promise existed on the campaign trail evaporated once actual decisions had to be made. The same old pattern continued, just with a different face attached to it. There is also a quieter story unfolding across the ocean that deserves attention here, because it shows this pattern is not limited to just one country. In Germany, there are reports of political leaders exploring ways to limit the power of certain regional states, specifically to prevent a rising nationalist party from gaining enough regional control to block future military decisions involving Russia. Whatever you think about the politics involved, the underlying signal is the same one showing up everywhere across the political West right now. Institutions bending, sometimes quietly and sometimes not so quietly, to keep the machinery of militarization moving forward, even when large parts of the public clearly want something different. This is the real heartbreak at the center of Wilkerson's warning. It is not simply that America is losing its position as the world's dominant power. Every empire in history eventually loses that position. Britain lost it. Rome lost it. Every single hegemon in recorded history has eventually stepped back from the top of the mountain. That part is almost unavoidable and, in some ways, even natural. The real tragedy is how it is happening, not through a slow, thoughtful transition where a declining power adjusts gracefully to a changing world, not through the kind of careful diplomacy that allows a nation to remain respected even after its peak has passed. Instead, according to Wilkerson, it is happening through denial, through internal decay, through leadership more interested in appearing strong than actually being wise, and through a public too disconnected to demand something better. He describes it almost like watching a slow-motion collision, one where everyone involved can see it coming and yet somehow nobody pulls the wheel in time. The system that was supposed to protect the country from exactly this kind of failure, the checks, the balances, the informed and engaged citizenry the founders imagined, has grown so tired, so worn down over 2.5 centuries that it barely responds anymore. Quick pause before the ending, because this next part ties everything together. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about where this is heading. So drop a comment below telling me which part surprised you the most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. And that brings us to the deepest question buried inside this entire conversation. If the old structure of American global power really is fading, the real issue is never going to be about losing that top position. Every great power eventually does. The real issue is what kind of country steps back from the mountain. Does it step back with wisdom, learning from its mistakes, adjusting its behavior, building new kinds of relationships based on genuine partnership instead of domination? Or does it step back the way Wilkerson fears, angry and denial, still reaching out to strike anyone who challenges it, dragging its own people into deeper division along the way? Wilkerson does not offer a comfortable answer to that question, and honestly, that is what makes his warning so powerful. He's not selling hope just to make people feel better. He spent his entire career close enough to real power to know exactly how these systems function, and exactly how badly they can fail when nobody is watching closely enough. So here's the real question this leaves us with, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. History does not usually announce the exact moment an empire ends. There is no giant sign in the sky, no single dramatic event that historians can point to 100 years later and say, this was the day it happened. It shows up in smaller signs first, in diplomats disappearing from embassies, in institutions quietly losing their authority, in a public that stops paying attention because paying attention feels exhausting and pointless, in leadership more focused on appearing powerful than actually solving the problems sitting right in front of them. Maybe the real danger was never really about which country would eventually rise to challenge American power. China was always going to grow. Russia was always going to hold on to its resources and its territory. Every empire eventually meets a rival, and every rival eventually catches up in some form or another. That part of the story has repeated itself throughout human history, over and over again, in almost every century. The real danger, the one Wilkerson keeps circling back to again and again throughout everything he says, is what happens on the inside while the outside world keeps changing. A country can survive losing its position at the very top. Britain did exactly that. It stepped back from empire and still exists today as a respected, functioning nation with a clear identity and a stable government. But a country cannot easily survive. losing its own sense of self while that transition is happening, especially not if nobody inside is willing to admit what is actually going on. That is the sacrifice Wilkerson is describing when he talks about a leader who chooses to preserve the appearance of empire instead of protecting the health of the republic underneath it. Not a single dramatic decision made in one moment, but 1,000 smaller ones. Choosing threats instead of diplomacy, choosing loyalty over honesty, choosing the comfort of an old story about greatness instead of the harder, more uncomfortable work of actually confronting the truth. And maybe that is the most important lesson buried inside this entire warning. Empires do not usually fall because a rival finally becomes strong enough to knock them down. They fall because they stop being honest with themselves long before the ending actually arrives. The question is never really whether the sun sets on every empire eventually. It always does, without a single exception in recorded history. The real question, the one that actually matters, is whether the people living through that sunset choose to see it clearly while there is still time left to do something about it, or whether they simply keep watching from the sidelines until the choice is made for them instead. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture more clearly, do one thing before you go. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe so you catch the next deep dive the moment it drops, and drop a comment telling me what you think happens next. History is still being written right now, in real time, and whether we are paying attention or not, we are all part of how this story eventually ends.